Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Language Arts Gallery. Today, we're going to talk about a new genre of writing. We're going to talk about poetry. And today's video is just an introduction into different types of poetry. We're going to talk about reasons that poets choose to write poetry. We're going to go over 6 different types of poems that you can choose to write. And throughout our course, we're going to be focusing on 3 of those. So if you haven't already, please like, subscribe, and comment on the video so you can see all those videos on our different genres of poetry. And if you're interested in using these materials in your own course, you can follow the link in the description to get this lesson or to get my complete creative writing course in my Teachers Pay Teachers store. Again, for my students from Myanmar, please do not purchase any of the materials. If you need anything, please just send me a message in Signal and I will send that to you for free. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so as I said, we're going to be talking about a new genre of poetry today. So I want you to think, first of all, what is poetry? What does it mean to you? When you think of poetry, famous poets, famous poems that you read, what makes poetry special? What makes it different than other types of writing, like narrative writing, which we've already talked about? Well, one thing that is different is narrative writing, of course, tells a story. And poetry can tell stories as well. There's what we call narrative poems, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But poetry ultimately is seeking to express the feelings of the poet. And he's trying to elicit a response from the reader. He or she might be trying to stir the reader's imagination to get them to respond in an emotional way to the poem that they're writing. So let's talk about some of these different emotions that people can experience. They can be things like happiness, sadness, anger, excitement. They can also be things like loneliness or longing, or pride, or it could be anywhere on the spectrum of emotions. Poetry also allows us to create imagery for our reader. So we talked about describing scenes and moments and elongating those moments. We talked about using figurative language like similes, metaphor, personification, and hyperbole. Poets can do all of those things. And finally, we want to share our experiences. Sometimes sharing those experiences might be in the form of a story, like a narrative poem. Sometimes it might be just a moment in nature. And we're going to talk about that in our next video when we talk about writing haiku. So let's go ahead and talk about 6 different types of poems. Now, I'm not going to discuss these at length. I'm just going to introduce you to these 6 different types of poems. They're rhymed poetry, free verse poetry, narrative poems, limericks, acrostic poems, which I love. They're a lot of fun to write. I always write acrostic poems with my young learners, but I think these are fun to write at any age. And haiku, which we're going to be discussing in our next video. So let's start with rhymed poems. So here we've got a very, very simple poem. Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, which everyone knows. Rhymed poems have the same ending sound, and they follow a particular pattern known as the rhyme scheme, which we're going to discuss in a future video in this genre. Free verse poems do not have to rhyme. They can rhyme, but they don't have to. They don't follow a particular pattern. There's no rhyme scheme to a free verse poem. So many poets, many authors prefer to write rhymed poetry because there's a structure to it, that rhyme scheme that they set out to follow. Whereas other poets prefer the freedom of being able to write a free verse poem. And that's the really cool thing about writing poetry is that you have that freedom to choose which genre you feel most comfortable writing in. Narrative poems, I've talked about this briefly earlier. Just like narrative writing tells a story. A narrative poem tells a story as well. Narrative poems have characters, they have a setting, they have a plot, and they follow the structure of a story. There's a beginning, middle, and an end. Limericks, I love. Limericks are a five-line poem, and they're very funny. They follow a particular rhyme scheme, a particular pattern, and we're going to go over an example here. So this limerick says, there once was a cat named Jade who napped in the sun and the shade. She'd pounce on a string, then sleep like a king in a throne that her whiskers had made. So when we look at this, jade, shade, and maid, the first, second, and fifth lines all rhyme, whereas string and king, the third and fourth lines, also rhyme. Acrostic poems, as I said, they're really fun to write with young learners, but I think they can be fun at any age. When we write an acrostic poem, we take the name of whatever it is that we're describing, and we start each line with the letter of whatever it is we're describing. So we'll start with the first letter, and then we'll move to the subsequent letter. So here we're describing a bear. So the first line starts with B, the second line starts with E, the third line starts with A, and the final line starts with R. So you can imagine if you're describing something that has a rather long name, you're going to have a lot of letters and you're going to have a longer poem. Whereas bear is only 4 letters, so it's a 4-line poem. And whatever you write in these poems, it should describe whatever it is you're describing. So our 4 lines should describe a bear. And we can see here that they do. Bold and strong in forest, eager eyes that never sleep, ambling through the woods, roaming free from day to night. So B-E-A-R spells bear, and that's how our lines are arranged in an acrostic poem. So this acrostic poem does not rhyme, however, many do. And it's up to you as the poet as to whether or not you want to make that poem rhyme. And finally, haiku. I love haiku. It is a 3-line form of Japanese poetry. Haiku are usually written about nature, and they follow a particular pattern of syllables. The first line has 5 syllables, the second has 7 syllables, and the last line has 5 syllables. So in our next video, we're going to talk in more detail about haiku, and we're going to go over some examples of haiku poetry.